Welcome to theAnalysis-news. Paul Jay is busy editing How to Stop a Nuclear War, the documentary based on Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine. I'm Barry Stevens, Paul's co-writer on that project, and today I'm hosting The Analysis. In just a few seconds, I'll be back with historian Peter Kuznick, and we're going to talk about the presidency of Donald Trump, its historical roots, its implications. Please don't forget, there's a donate button, and I'll be back in just a second. So joining me today is Peter Kuznick. Peter is a professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C., and the co-founder of the Nuclear Education Project. He's, as those names suggest, he's written extensively on nuclear weapons, their use on Japan in the Second World War, obviously, and he's very much expert on the Cold War and the United States. And with the movie director Oliver Stone, he co-wrote the Showtime TV series, The Untold History of the United States, and the subsequent book with the same title, which I very much recommend as a corrective to standard narratives. He comments frequently on the media, and we're very lucky to have him on The Analysis. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Barry. Always happy to be with you.
Now, this week, President Trump made an extraordinary speech at the United Nations where he called global warming a con job and said that immigration was a global disaster, among other rants. And this is sort of really just the latest drama in the first 8 months of the second presidency of Mr. Trump, in which he's tried to accumulate, succeeded, I think, in accumulating a lot of power to the executive branch. He's attacked universities. He's attacked the media, he's rounded up migrants and put them in prison camps, upended government, generally had contempt for the rule of law, I would say, and the Constitution of the United States. And there hasn't been a lot of organized opposition, it doesn't seem to me. But he's been jokingly called the Orange Julius Caesar. That's my favorite, by the way. Or the dime store Duce. But how much of that is a joke, and how much is it over the top to call this fascism? Obviously, the far right has a long history in the United States in 1950s, 1930s, and there's been a long history of militarism and militarism in the United States. But are we seeing something new here, Peter? Is this sui generis, or does this have historical antecedents? How are we to understand this as you as a historian? How would you understand it?
Well, in the beginning, many people treated Trump as a joke. Remember when he first addressed the United Nations, they laughed at him. He made his speech this week, even saying more outlandish things. People thought he's totally out of his mind, but they didn't laugh at him this time. They know that he is really dangerous, and he might be unhinged. He might be the biggest narcissist and megalomaniac on the planet. However, he's also, at this point, the most dangerous. And the United States has always had extreme right-wingers, has always had incipient fascist tendencies. But what Trump represents is an imminent fascist threat. And when we talk about fascism, it doesn't mean Hitlerian fascism. It doesn't necessarily follow even Mussolini's playbook. It doesn't follow the playbook of earlier American fascists. Trump has got his own kind of approach to fascism. And when we see his total disregard for law and order, for laws, for the Constitution, for the separation of powers, for the independence of the judiciary, for the proper role of the military in American life, for even minimally taking advice and counsel. He doesn't operate the way other presidents have, and which, especially in the nuclear age, terrifies me. So we see him being mercurial. We see him changing on a dime, 180-degree reversals from day to day sometimes in his policies. public statements, some things that occasionally seem to make some sense, but if they do, then he's almost certain to go against them in the near future. So I think we're at a very tenuous moment in our history, partly because the Supreme Court seems to give him carte blanche, allow him to do anything he wants, partly because Congress is spineless and so venal and so cowed by him that it won't stand up to him at all, partly because he's turned the Republican Party from a political party into a cult. And so we've never quite seen this. And he's got his MAGA base, which is loyal to a fault, no matter what he does. And we see a Democratic Party in complete disarray, without any real leadership, without a sense of direction, without a program. And so Trump is getting away with things. As the Supreme Court says, he can do what he wants as president, and he can't be held criminally liable for any of the things he's done. The Pentagon has pushed back some, but unlike the first term, when Trump was surrounded with adults who tried to rein him in and prevent him from carrying out his most extreme and malign tendencies and acting on them, all those people are gone. And now, so the Kellys, the General Kellys and all, who try to constrain him, even Rex Tillerson, who I'm no fan, I'm not a fan of any of these people really, but when Trump called for a tenfold increase in U.S. nuclear weapons during the first term, Tillerson called him a fucking moron. But who's going to call him a fucking moron now? Maybe Jimmy Kimmel, maybe late night comedians, maybe you and I, but certainly none of the people who've got the power to stop him from doing what he's doing. So we've seen in front after front, issue and after issue, arena after arena, he's doing things that no other president has ever done, or certainly not to the extent that he's done them. So we are really vulnerable of losing. We don't have a great, vibrant democracy, but we do have some democracy left. And much of that is what he's going after. I saw the other day, came across Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh says in his 1993 book, "See, I told you so." And he warned his fellow conservatives, quote, "We have lost control of our major cultural institutions. Liberalism long ago captured the arts, the press, the entertainment industry, the universities, the schools, the libraries, the foundations, etc. We could throw in museums. We could throw in mass media, throw in television. And they've gone systematically after all of those institutions that Limbaugh pointed out the liberals and the left have controlled in American life. And they've systematically reclaimed them for Trump and the extreme right wing and a proto-fascist element. And so we're in a quite serious predicament as a country right now.
But the rise of fascism, if we're going to compare it to that, the rise of fascism in Spain and Italy and Germany or other places followed periods of great difficulty and distress. If there'd been an alternative to this, do you think the American people would have backed it? I guess the question is, if the Democratic Party or anybody had delivered on welfare for the people of the United States, whether healthcare or housing or income security, would they have been so drawn to this man and his movement?
No, I think part of it is that people are hurting. Also, Americans have no sense of history, zero. We can get into that. Um, but as Joe and Lai once said, that's the charming thing about the Americans. They have absolutely no historical memory. But George Santayana had a different take on it, where he said, Most people know that his statement that if you forget, don't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it. However, he also said, a nation without memory is a nation of madmen. And I think we're in that dilemma because in 2020, the American people voted for Joe Biden, sleepy Joe Biden, who is not a great candidate in any sense. But they voted for him over Trump by 7 million votes. They
Mm.
were so tired of Trump, so sick of Trump. Uh, but 4 years later, they forgot how much they disliked Trump and they voted him back in office. It's very dangerous to have a country without any sense of history.
It reminds me of, I think it was in was it the 18th Brumaire, Mark saying history repeats itself. The first time was it's tragedy, and the second time is
That was
farce.
farce, yeah. And Trump is farcical, but not only is Trump farcical, you look at the people around him. We have this 19th century word, kakistocracy, that refers to a government by the worst people. And you look at who Trump has appointed for all these different positions. Where do you come up with a Kristi Noem, a Pete Hegseth, a Marco Rubio? I mean, you go down the list of the people he's surrounded himself with. First of all, they're enablers, but even worse, they're the worst kinds of sycophants. One of the truly extraordinary spectacles of the new Trump presidency is his televised cabinet meetings where they go around the room and each one tries to outdo the previous one in telling Trump how wonderful he is. He's the best looking president we've ever had, the smartest president, the most benevolent president. I just go there is a spectacle that you don't see coming out of North Korea. This whole notion of dear leader, where
And we saw that we saw this also with European leaders, that same
yeah,
sycophants
they come here,
around the
they
table,
bow down.
which must have been a little more difficult for somebody like Macron, I would imagine, to do, but they did it. They kissed the ring.
Yeah, it's an obscene spectacle, and that's what Trump needs to feed his ego. Even though, I mean, how could anybody have any respect for any of these people who so humble and abase themselves, perform fellatio on him in front of the televised audience? You can't respect people like that. But this is the kind of massaging of ego that Trump not only needs, but demands,
Yeah.
in addition to bribes. So he has all these foreign countries. In order to get a better trade deal, they've got to bribe him. We're going to spend $350 billion on investing in the U.S. We'll spend 500 billion, but also from the private business, from the corporations. They've got to give bribes. So it's an organized corruption plus all the money he's raking in with his crypto deals and this $400 million plane that he's getting from Qatar, which he's going to control after his presidency. I mean, we've never seen this level of corruption. If you
Yeah.
talk about the Teapot Dome scandals, the Harding scandals, the Ulysses Grant scandals, Nixon scandals, they pale by comparison.
Hmm.
There's nothing ever remotely approaching this kind of open corruption, but he does it very openly. And there's no resistance in terms of the other power structures, power centers who are supposed to resist this. This is why if our founding fathers saw what's going on, they would turn over in their graves because they could not imagine this level of tyranny.
Weren't they specifically concerned about the possibility of this happening, of tyranny?
They couldn't imagine this level of it so openly, flagrantly, blatantly being done in open right before the public. So Trump was correct to talk about the corruption under Biden. When we got to Ukraine, Biden, under the Obama years, was the liaison officer in charge of hundreds of meetings, phone calls, visits, and there was obviously this element of corruption given his son's involvement with energy companies in Ukraine and profiting off that, and then the other members of the family profiting off the Biden name. But what that represents is maybe 1/100th of the level of corruption in the first Trump or the second Trump, especially the second Trump presidency, where all restraints are off.
Yeah, there's with respect to this cult of personality around Trump, which he fosters and which seems to just grow. Um, that has correlates with fascism, obviously, leader worship, and other aspects of it, the racism, the contempt for law. But one thing that doesn't seem to be so true is the desire for military conquest. You saw that in Japan and Italy and in Germany, of course. But that, and in fact, I must say personally, I was in every way would have preferred another president than Trump, but in the one way where I thought he's less likely to start a big war because he really, being a mercantilist, he just doesn't see the profit in it. And also the movement behind him really was his phrase, forever wars, was a very good phrase, I thought. If it was his originally, I don't know.
No, it wasn't his originally.
But he adopted it, and the movement certainly was against forever wars. And so I thought in that one way, um, that was something potentially positive about this presidency. What do you think about that possibility?
I mean, I agree with you in principle, but I might take issue with you in terms of the actual practice of that. Uh, Trump, he comes in and he starts talking about taking Panama, taking Greenland, so he's
And my country, Canada.
Canada too. I mean, so he's pretty open about that, but it's mostly talk and hot air. And if people push back, then he lets go of it. But I think out of stupidity, out of recklessness, out of impetuousness, he could very easily get us involved in another war, even though some of his own inclinations are against it. And when I talk about that, I think of the two or three or four major hotspots. Obviously, the immediate one is Ukraine, and we were pushing toward the potential for ending the war by negotiations. When he and Putin met in Alaska, and he rolls out the red carpet for Putin, they had come basically to an agreement on most of the major points. That Ukraine would not be in NATO, that Russia would keep the 20% of Ukrainian territory that it now holds, and they'd figure out a way for some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, I have my ideas how that would be. Putin made clear he didn't want NATO in there, NATO countries, but of the five permanent Security Council members, the one that contributes more troops to international peacekeeping than the other four combined is China. And China has was the Ukraine's biggest trading partner before the invasion.
Mm,
They have decent relations. And when Brazil and China put forth their 12-point peace plan, point number one was the importance of sovereignty, which was a criticism of Russia for invading a sovereign Ukraine.
mm,
Point number two was that no nation's national security should be achieved at the expense of any other nation's national security, which was a critique of NATO for expanding to Russia's borders and wanting Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO, which George W. Bush called for fast tracking in 2008. And so that was a critique of NATO and Ukraine and the United States. So it was China's approach has been fairly balanced. They've given a lot of dual use technology that Russia's been able to make use of, and they've helped Russia economically by buying so much more oil and gas and other trade. But I could see that India has plays a huge role in international peacekeeping. There are ways to do that that don't recreate the NATO presence that Putin was defying and invading, and that could provide some stability there. So I was very optimistic. But what did Trump do this week? He meets with Zelensky after his absurd UN presentation, and then he meets with Zelensky, and Zelensky convinces him that Russia is teetering economically, and if we increase the sanctions and we keep giving arms to Ukraine, especially through the Europeans, then Ukraine can actually claw back the 20% of territory that Russia holds, which is
And but by the way, he also said both orally and on Truth Social that and maybe more. Like
maybe more, yeah, maybe
he
more.
implied that Ukraine could take more Russian territory, and that would be the red line of red lines.
Well, that would be the nuclear war red line. Uh, but there's one lesson that I draw from this, and I've been talking about this in my talks this week, is that the implication of that is actually very important. He called Russia a paper tiger. He said Russia never wins wars. Now that's haven't been saying it in that context, but I've been saying that the big lies about the U.S. involvement in supporting Ukraine, number one, that this was a full-scale invasion. It didn't start off as a full-scale invasion. It was minimal effort originally, and they didn't expect the resistance. Number two, that Ukraine can win back that territory, which it can't and it won't. Number three, that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he will gobble up one piece of Europe after another. That's the scenario that all these European leaders have been rolling out. This idea that Putin wants to recreate the old Soviet empire and was going to do that starting with Ukraine. And I keep saying this is absurd. It's nonsense. It's taken Putin 3.5 years to get 20% of Ukraine. Does he really want to go after NATO? I mean, he'd have to be totally insane. He'd have to be even more insane than Donald Trump to think in those terms. And now what Trump is saying, that Russia is a paper tiger, reinforces what I was saying, that of course they're not going to go after Europe after this, which Putin himself said. What Putin said was anybody who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Anybody who wants to recreate the Soviet Union has no brain. So Putin's been clear about that.
That was, I think, in the same speech where he said it was, and it's the translation is actually in dispute whether it was a great disaster of the 20th century or the greatest. It's usually quoted as the greatest, but Russian is not quite the same language. So yeah, it's clear that, well, it was clear that he was modifying that claim at that point. But
Barry, let me just make the point that this is the way they get the publics. Back in 53, so Stalin dies March 5th, 1953. And then Malenkov for the Politburo holds out an olive branch to the United States and says, we want to meet and talk and resolve all our differences. They were basically calling for an end of the Cold War in early 53. Eisenhower had recently come to office, and Eisenhower did not respond for 6 weeks. Then he gave one of the most important, maybe the most important speech of his presidency. And he says that every dollar that's spent on weapons, on bombers, on bombs, on jet planes, on all these military things, he said, is a theft, that was the word he used, from the schools that we need to build, the roads we need to build, the housing we need to build, the food we need to provide. And so he goes on, he says, humanity hanging by a cross of iron,
mm,
which is so important. But how do these leaders, especially in Europe, uh, get their populations to go along? First, with spending 2% of GDP, as the U.S. was demanding on military, that now spending 5% of their GDP and saying they should spend up to 10%. How does Lay get his population in Taiwan to go along with that? The South Koreans, the Japanese are doubling their military spending by scaring the crap out of them, by saying that, look at this monster, Putin, who is a new Hitler. And if once he gets a foothold in Ukraine, he's coming after us. We're next. The Germans are believing that and increasing their military spending. I was on the other day. I do a lot of these Indian TV shows, and
Mm.
many of which
I've seen them, yeah.
are debate shows. And I was on the other day with a former Lithuanian defense minister, and she was saying Putin is as bad as, if not worse, than Hitler and Stalin. And so I said, we have to be very careful what we say. I said, years ago, I had Robert McNamara, the architect of the Vietnam War, and Paul Warnke, the Defense Department counsel, into class and talking about Vietnam. And they both agreed that one of the reasons why the United States got involved in Vietnam, invaded Vietnam, is because American policymakers were buying, believing, and thinking in terms of the Munich analogy. And if you don't stand up to a bully, a Hitler at Munich, then he's going to take the Sudetenland, he's going to take Poland, and he's going to try to conquer all of Europe. I said, but that kind of false historical analogy is what McNamara and Warnke said was what got us so off course in Vietnam because we believed it. That
Well,
plus the domino theory.
yeah, it's very interesting the whole Munich story and how it gets trotted out. I remember the 1980s during the Reagan Cold War, or the
Yeah.
Cold War, that period, it was used all the time. And I would always think, yes, but what about August 1914, when you had two great alliances who were committed to each other and committed to hostility between the two of them? That resulted in a pointless war, the Great War, which of course gave rise to the Second World War too. So that is a danger as well.
I think it's very dangerous. I think that's dangerous. Um, but that's the way they scare the public into supporting this. And the other is to think in terms of worst case scenarios, to exaggerate the opposition's, the enemy, strength, to create Putin as a larger than life boogeyman and Russia as so powerful, which we do in terms of repeatedly in terms of the threats, starting with NSC 68 in 1950. This was the plan that the government came up with to quadruple U.S. military spending in 1950. And they had got no traction at all till the Korean War started. And then the world was scared. And Churchill made an interesting comment. He said, Korea doesn't really matter. This is the end of the war. He said, Korea doesn't really matter. I never heard of the darn place till I was 74 years old. The importance of Korea is it's started the rearmament of the United States. And the United States did quadruple its military spending, did adopt NSC 68, but we saw the same thing happen after Sputnik.
So
This exaggeration of this idea that Russia has all these ICBMs. They've got hundreds more than we do, and we're at the most fragile, vulnerable point in our history. But we saw that over and over again, in terms of during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw it during Vietnam. We saw it during Reagan saying we're weaker than the Soviets. We massively increased Project for a New American Century. That brought the neocons into George W. Bush administration. Over and over again, we do that, and it justifies our fear of this powerful force that's out to get us, that if we give in at all, they're going to come and get us and we'll be finished.
I'm just going to take a break now, and say this is the end of part one with Peter Kuznick, and if you check your YouTube feed, you will find us in the second part, in which we'll talk about how this relates to the present.